So, hi everyone, and a warm welcome to today's seminar where we will discuss the persistent problem of pollution of pharmaceutical manufacturing and the role of public procurement. This is the third and last webinar that Swedwatch organizes together with the Swedish National Agency for Public Procurement this fall on risks in public procurement supply chains. Due to international interest, we have decided to do the full session in English. This webinar is being recorded and you will be able to find the recording on our website afterwards. My name is Anna Åkerblom and I work at Swedwatch and I will be moderating this session. And just briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, Swedwatch is a non-profit research organization focusing on businesses' impacts on human rights and the environment. We have published 100 in-depth reports, and including reports on public procurement. At the end of this seminar, we will have a Q&A session, but you are able to post your questions in the chat function during the webinar, and we will try to pick them up. You're also welcome to post questions in Swedish, and we will do our best to translate them. So with us today, we have a panel of distinguished speakers who will provide different perspectives on the topic. We have Lisa Sandström, who is a procurement lawyer at the Swedish National Agency for Public Procurement. We have my colleague, Yayoi Lagerqvist, who has been conducting research on this topic over the last years. Warm welcome to you. We have Anil Dayakar from the community-based organization Gamana, which is active in Hyderabad, India. And Hyderabad, for those of you who are not familiar with the region, is the global pharmaceutical manufacturing hub. A warm welcome to you, Anil. And last but not least, we have Professor Joachim Larsson from the University of Gothenburg, who is a specialist in this type of emissions and in antibiotic resistance. So without further ado, I will give the word to Lisa, who will set the scene for today's webinar.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa Sandström, and I work at the National Agency for Public Procurement. We are responsible for providing public procurement support on a national level in Sweden. And we want to be a knowledge hub for public business. And that means that if you have a question about public procurement, whatever it might be, you can turn to us and find an answer to your question. And I work at our sustainability unit, and we work with developing support and how to conduct a sustainable public procurement. We do that by developing sustainability criteria, guidance, tool, information, and many other things. I just wanted to give you a short introduction to this seminar and why we talk about risks in the supply chain for pharmaceuticals and public procurement today. So I would just start with this probably or hopefully well-known picture of the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, the goals, the SDGs are really important for us, a guidance for us, and gives us a direction of what we should work with. The National Agency for Public Procurement shall increase the knowledge on how public procurement can contribute to the implementation of the Agenda 2030 for a sustainable development. And actually, the Nordic Council of Ministers, they published a report in May 2021, earlier this year, and stated that public procurement can be used as a tool to achieve all of the goals in the agenda. So that is something that we find is truly inspiring, that we actually work with a really powerful tool here. And of course, in Sweden, the national procurement strategy is also important to us. I'm sorry, change slide here. The national procurement strategy that was published in 2016 also gives us guidance in what we should prioritize and what we should work with. And as you can see, the first target is an overall goal, and that says that public procurement shall be used as a strategic tool for doing good business. And the other 6 goals must be in place for target 1 to be achieved. And the other goals are that concerns an efficient purchasing, multiplicity of suppliers and well-functioning competition, legally certain public procurement that drives innovation and alternative solutions, environmentally responsible public procurement, and public procurement contributing to socially sustainable society. So that is goal 6 and 7 is what we're going to talk about more today. And I also wanted to say that the Swedish government just a couple of weeks ago announced that they want to change the Swedish public procurement legislation and want to make amendments to the procurement laws that are proposed to enter into force on the 1st of July 2022. And it says that a contracting authority shall take into account the climate in public procurement. The authority shall also consider the environmental considerations, human health, animal welfare, and social and labor law aspects when it is relevant with regard to the purpose of procurement. And legislation today states that that you should take these considerations into account. So this is a clear change of ambition. So that was my short introduction, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and it will be really interesting to follow the developments with the Swedish legislation, I think. Now, I am happy to introduce my colleague, Yayoi Lagerqvist, who is the author of the 2020 report, The Health Paradox, as well as the policy paper Towards Increased Transparency in the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain, which is being launched today. Yayoi will provide a background on the topic and share thoughts on environmental and social risks associated with drug manufacturing. So the floor is yours, Yayoi.
So as you've heard from Anna, my colleague, Swedwatch is a Swedish non-profit organization based here in Stockholm, and we focus on business and human rights. As Anna kindly mentioned earlier, we've published a report in 2020 focusing on the issues of pharmaceutical sector, particularly with regards to management of industrial emissions from the manufacturing. Majority of active pharmaceutical ingredients are produced outside of Europe. It varies in percentage, but around 60 to 80% produced in China and India. And in our health paradox report, we try to examine this very complex supply chain and facilitate discussions that lead towards mitigation of industrial emissions from the manufacturing. One of the starting point of writing this report was, do we know where our medicines come from and how they're made? And oftentimes, unlike other consumer goods, it's very difficult to know where medicines are actually produced and how. In our report, we also highlighted the widespread environmental and social impact of industrial emissions from pharmaceutical manufacturing. Our case study was based in Hyderabad, which is a prominent global hub for pharmaceutical manufacturing. In our report, use of industrial emissions from manufacturing, we've highlighted that the use of industrial emissions from manufacturing have contaminated water for drinking and household use. But of course, the pollution affects far beyond water quality. Livestock loss, soil contamination, halved agriculture production, loss of livelihoods, human health impacts, etc. So there's a tremendous social and environmental impact of this industrial emissions that are continuing yet today. And our colleague from Hyderabad, Anil, will further discuss this in the next part of this seminar. So now there's also a growing evidence of industrial emissions and its ecological impacts. There's growing numbers of scientific studies that point to this issue. And yet, limited actions have been taken thus far to mitigate the risk. Some scholars refer to this as a structural problem, something as a slow violence, that's something that you don't immediately see the effect, a dramatic effect, but cumulatively affecting the lives of people and local ecosystem. So our main message to the audience today is that medicines that save lives elsewhere, say in developed nations, should not contribute to human deaths and environmental deterioration elsewhere, especially in places where medicines are being manufactured. And so this calls for due diligence. And then the big question is due diligence by whom? As we highlighted in our earlier report, pharmaceutical sector, there are complex actors involved, and they're also globally located. And so it's often very difficult to trace where the medicines are made and who is involved, how are the medicines actually being produced. And pharmaceuticals, unlike other consumer goods, also require knowledge of specially trained professionals in this sector. So this really heightens the importance of the public authorities in carrying out due diligence across the sector. And of course, there are voluntary initiatives, but unfortunately, there haven't been a significant effect in reducing the actual industrial emissions. And part of this problem we assess is due to the little visibility in the supply chain. So there is a little motivation to self-regulate and change the actual practice. And so we like to highlight that in order to increase accountability of supply chain actors in this sector and to reduce ecological and human health risks, we need more transparency. In recent years, in OECD policies, as well as in the EU, life cycle approach to pharmaceuticals are being highlighted, and we think these are good changes. And there are also discussions within the industry to move towards more environmentally sustainable pharmaceuticals. And we think these are the good changes that are needed. However, at the same time, we think that the transparency of the information could also be improved. And we also believe that there needs to be a systemic change in the supply chain governance. And in order for actors to strengthen their due diligence, once again, transparency is needed. So that brings me to the end of my part of the talk. I would like to hand over the next part of this seminar to Anil Dayakar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that background, Yayoi. And now we have the great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Anil Dayakar from the community-based organization Gamana. As you heard in Yayoi's presentation, he's active in Hyderabad, and Anil has fought for the justice of the local population affected by pharmaceutical pollution for 15 years now. Anil, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hello, everybody.
Hi, we can hear
We hear you, Anil.
Hello.
We can hear you fine, Anil. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
Yep. So basically, I am from the ground level situation where almost 2,500 industries are causing this global pandemic, you can say. The antimicrobial resistance developing in the communities here as well as developing elsewhere in the world. And the root cause lies here only. So we have been fighting on this issue for the last 15 years just to influence the political system here as well as the marketing system and the administrative authorities and the controlling boards. Still, we could not be able to achieve the proper result in protecting the social and economic situation of the communities living nearby in this Patancheru polluted area. Still, we are not lost in our hopes, and we are still continuing our fight. And as and when there is a new law imposing certain parameters, mostly benefiting the industry and favoring the marketing mechanism, still we are opposing all those things. And it is all caused by one simple reason. It is just unethical dumping of solid and liquid waste onto the ground and to the liquid water bodies like community tanks and irrigation water sources like that. So this pollution is entering the human chain through consuming this water and the local resources. So it is entering the human chain like that, and it is encouraged by the public authorities as they're not transparent, they're not sincere. The industry is not sincere in their production process because they get the permission for one particular drug, but in the process they go for producing different medicines and drugs without the knowledge of the people as well as the authorities. Even the controlling authorities knows the reason, still they don't act. And it goes with the qualities also. They take permission for one particular quality and quantity, and still they violate without the knowledge of authorities. Even if it is happening like that in the industries, and the next the phase, that is the treatment of effluents, there also what is happening is it's all simply a farce. Because in the treatment plants they add sewage water to the chemical industrial effluents, and they dilute it and releasing into the open channels and streams, which reaches the nearby rivers and water bodies. So this is the main cause of the spread of this particular antimicrobial resistance in this particular area. We have identified this particular problem in 2005 itself. We have taken the issue to the political authorities, administrative authorities, and to the controlling authorities, but nothing had happened so far at the ground level. And one more thing is, even after 15 years, it is not reducing, and the situation is worsening further because more and more industries are they're coming up, and they're going to establish their expanded units in this particular region. Next. No, this is the status of affairs on the ground level. This happens especially during the rainy season. The industries, they find it very convenient to release the effluents just like that into the open nalas, open channels and streams during the rainy season, thinking that it adds to the rainwater and reaches nearby streams. So even if the communities take this sample, it doesn't hold good. So these pictures show the state of affairs even in the treatment in the treatment plants. Next. Now we have this big problem. The government of the local state, that is state government of Telangana, they proposed for setting up of a big Hyderabad pharma city, and expanding in 78 square kilometers area, which is going to be a serious problem to the communities living on the other part of the city. The government has proposed this particular pharma city, stating that the existing polluting industries in Patancheru and nearby areas, they would be shifted to the new pharma city, so that the Patancheru problem area will not have this sort of pollution problem. But what actually happening is, we all suspect that the big major industries, they will have their expanded units in the pharma city, rather than closing down the existing mechanisms or the units functioning in Patancheru area. Because take the case of one particular major industry, they have 18 units in and around Patancheru. It is simply illogical to ask them to move to the new areas, because they knew very well that after establishment of new expanded unit in Hyderabad Pharma City, they will simply go to the court of law, get the stay order stating that the workforce will be affected. That's why there is no need to move these units from Patancheru area. So what at the end of the day, what happens is, after the establishment of the pharma city, these big industries, they'll have their expanded units in the pharma city, so that there'll be more production and a bigger problem. So after studying the pollution, documenting the pollution area status in Patancheru area, Greenpeace has released the documentary naming it as Hell on Earth, naming the Patancheru area for that. So now with this pharma city in Hyderabad, they're going to create another hell and some bigger hell, so that there'll be the more violations and more suffering for the people living around that particular pharma city. That is expanding the pollution problem from one area to the another fresh area, so that in 5 years or 10 years down the line, the new area of Hyderabad pharma city will have the same sort of problem what the people of Patancheru are suffering now. Next. So these are the clippings from the newspaper, how the community is opposing the setting up of this Hyderabad pharma city. And in the first paragraph, you can see two ladies who gave the paper statements opposing the setup vehemently, and they came public also to voice their grievances. The second photograph clearly shows one woman touching the feet of the administrative authorities and the political leaders, not to allow this pharma city to come up in that particular villages. So this will show how the people are resentful against this setting up of Hyderabad pharma city. Still nobody is bothered, no administration is bothered, no political system is bothered. They are hell bent upon going ahead with the setting up of the pharma city. The land acquisition is still going on, and the public hearings they're all the farce. The people living nearby, they were not given opportunity to participate in the public hearing processes. It was outright opposition to the setting up of pharma city. Next. The root cause of whole pollution problem here in India, especially in Patancheru, is the corruption. It's a deep-rooted corruption, because at every stage of starting from establishment of the industry to the operation levels, they get their consents, their licenses and allowances from the public authorities and the controlling authorities, just through bribing the system outright from top to bottom. So in the process, they just manipulate the entire production processes, and simply on unethical grounds, not heeding to the environmental standards. And because of this pollution problem, not framing of new rules or regulations will not solve any problem, because the industries find it as convenient mechanism to get that sort of allowance for this new rules and regulations, so that once they get this acceptance from and certification for this new rules and regulations, they can simply get away with the flouting of the norms. This has been happening for the last 15 years. Still, we approach the courts of law also, but nothing has happened because the controlling authorities, they come to the court saying that nothing is happening there. In last hearing of the case, the Pollution Control Board of Telangana, they came out stating that there is no pollution problem in Patancheru. For them, as per their records, the problem in Patancheru has been resolved by simply laying an 18 kilometers pipeline through transfer the pollutants from one particular river body to another particular river body. So now they say that there is no pollution in Patancheru. So what we find here as a correct solution for us, which is practical, is so an independent monitoring mechanism specifically for each procuring agency, because we are thoroughly failed at the ground level. We try to influence the market mechanism also. There also the market mechanism came up with some solutions stating that so and so rules have to be followed, so and so restrictions have to be made, like that. The one particular is the particular solution suggested was GMP, but still that is also flouted. I will show you how it has been flouted in our country. So what we require is an umbrella supervision of public procurement agencies, like what is happening in Sweden. Like public procuring authority will have their own independent monitoring mechanisms or certification mechanism for each and every industry which is supplying their produce to these countries, so that the monitoring mechanism or agency can easily pinpoint who is violating, how they are violating, how they are getting away with the violation of environmental standards. I think this is the only solution, instead of setting up a general monitoring body for the entire pharma industry, for the entire country. So it has to be a supply chain specific mechanism that can resolve the problem to some extent. Next. Next. So this is GMP. Just before that, on slide ahead. Yeah, good manufacturing practices. I just want to illustrate here how the controlling authorities and the public agencies who are there to control the violations as far as the production process are concerned, how they are influenced by the bribing mechanism in the country, in our country. So this GMP certification, the industry is finding it as a moral boasting and big bliss, because once the certification is done, they can simply show to the authorities, the controlling authority, stating that they have a certification from externally monitoring agency, stating that all their production processes are given green signal to go ahead. So that is the status of FIs here as far as GMC certification is concerned. I just want to establish how corruption is causing even the failure of GMP certification. Take the case of one global organic village. This is a proprietorship firm established by one of my close friends. That's how I came to know about this. So the thing is, the company has not started its business yet. So far, there is no factory premises till date. So obviously, there will not be any production process in the factory, and the company has not recruited any personnel, any workforce to run the show. But they got the GMP certification without having anything on the ground. They got GMP certification much ahead of establishment of the company itself. Next. So this is the proof. Nobody knows how they got it, but everybody knows only one thing: they might have spent few hundred euros to get this certification. Unfortunately, the certificate was given by one UK agency, UK-based agency. They have their units here who function according to the whims and fancies of the industry bodies here. So this is the status, and now you can now anybody can assess whatever the impositions from the external agencies for compliance with the environmental standards, not to violate, nothing will work out here. Our assessment is that only the prescriptions imposed by supply chain on the supply chain mechanism by the procurement agencies, that only will solve the issue to some extent, so that the other stakeholders can take over their job effectively to contain the pollution problem here in this Patancheru area, especially in Hyderabad region. That is what we all feel as an activist who are fighting against this atrocious attitude of the bulk drug manufacturer associations for the sake of the welfare of the communities from the Hyderabad. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anil. Yeah, the corruption and lack of consultation, remediation, and the slow progress is indeed deeply concerning. Okay, now we will turn to Joachim Larsson, who is, as I said, from the University of Gothenburg and an expert in antibiotic resistance. And you'll provide a scientific perspective on the risk of pharmaceutical emissions from manufacturing facilities, as well as what you see is needed from policymakers, public procurers, and companies. Go ahead, Joachim.
Thank you very much. So I will talk about pharmaceutical emissions from manufacturing and talk a little bit both about procurement and other incentivizing actions to basically mitigate risks. I will say first, of course, that pollution from drug manufacturing and many chemicals in the wastewater, in the waste, can have different types of effects, but I'll focus particularly on the drugs themselves, because that is what makes drug manufacturing effluent very special, because they can contain drug residues. And most drugs can cause effects on the local ecosystems and also on what we could call ecosystem services. And we had Yaoyi and Anil mention any of these, basically how we use water and land and different resources in different ways. But when it comes to antibiotics, they have those kinds of effects. But in addition to that, they can have indirect effects on global health if these antibiotics discharges drive the development and spread of antibiotic resistance. So they have a particular role, and I will talk mostly about antibiotics in this talk here. So first, the concentrations that you find in environments polluted by manufacturing industries are much higher than the concentrations of drugs that you find through other sources, as illustrated in this recent paper. So it's a big difference. It's the worst type of drug pollution that you find on the globe. Well, then how could pollution, environmental pollution with antibiotics, lead to resistance develop in the clinics? Well, resistance in bacteria, that's something that occurs naturally in many bacterial species. But as long as these resistance mechanisms or these genes stay in harmless environmental bacteria, that is not a problem. But bacteria change genes with each other. So the problem comes when these harmless bacteria share their resistance genes to pathogens, to bacterial pathogens. That's when we get a clinical problem. And this kinds of emergence of resistant pathogens, that only needs to happen once on the planet, anywhere. Then we cannot turn back the clock. Then we need to live with these new resistance factors. And this happens every year. We get more and more types of resistance factors in our bacteria, and they become more and more difficult to treat. And the most important driving factor for this is the selection by antibiotics that provides a growth advantage to the ones that have acquired resistance. And just to illustrate again how strong this selection pressure is that we find sometimes in polluted places from drug manufacturing. Here I contrast what we find in Patancheru in the wastewater. There, it's 30 milligrams per liter of ciprofloxacin, a very common antibiotic. compared to what we find in a typical European municipal wastewater treatment plant effluent, where we find like 30 nanograms. And the difference is huge. And I don't say this because 30 nanogram is nothing, because it's actually just below those levels that we think can select for resistance. I show it because 30 milligrams is a lot, and we cannot just close our eyes for this big pollution. So when we talk about wastewaters from antibiotic manufacturing and the impacted environments, these have the strongest antibiotic selection pressures on bacteria described on Earth. They're also the most extreme environments on Earth with respect to the occurrence of antibiotic resistance. These environments, we've shown in a number of papers, also have or harbor many unknown types of resistance genes that are not yet been transferred to pathogens. But when we take, for example, the material from a lake or from the shore on a highly polluted lake and mix that with sensitive E. coli bacteria, it only takes hours for the E. coli to take up these resistance factors and become resistant. So the path is short. India called this, or nature called this, India's drug problem. But I argue this is much bigger problem than that. It's everyone's problems. Because large emissions don't just occur in India. There's numerous reports about large emissions from drug manufacturing across the world, actually, also in Europe and in the US, for example. Yaoi have talked about the moral responsibility to act, which I think is obvious, of course. But then there's also the selfish interest to act in protecting ourselves from antibiotic resistance development, because resistance spreads across the globe as fast as a jumbo jet flies. So it's also our business from a selfish perspective to deal with this, not just the moral perspective. So a good thing is that industry, actually, the AMR Alliance, which is a consortium of a large number of industries that produce antibiotics, they've come together to define voluntary discharge limits for antibiotics, which they now want to launch and are launching among their members. But when a third-party auditing agency, I would say, the Access to Medicines Foundation, look at their success, they see that the industry reports a lot of success, but still none of these companies reveal where or by whom their subcontracted active ingredients are made. And none of the companies reveal how large emissions they actually have. So all the progress is still self-reported. And it's very difficult to assess progress independently. So we have to just rely on the words of industry themselves. We don't know where they're producing their drugs. So this lack of transparency makes it really difficult to hold individual big international companies accountable for the still ongoing pollution that Anil described earlier. So while voluntary action is really good and should be, I think, promoted, they're not enough. We cannot rely on that industry will resolve this themselves. So I think we need different incentivizing actions. And Swedes are basically a consuming country in this way. We don't produce a lot of antibiotics, but we can do a lot of things, and many other consuming countries can do so. So one thing is to demand transparency in the production chains, to ask or to actually demand that we should be able to know where and by whom are these active ingredients produced and formulated that we are using. And I think the report that Yaoi and colleagues published this morning describes this very well. So I recommend that reading. And this would make industry accountable for pollution that happens elsewhere, basically at no cost, because you could change this by an act of a pen. And the data, at least the data to where the drugs are produced and formulated, that data already exists. It's just that it's not public. It is public in one country, in New Zealand, a small country with 5 million people. They can do it. Anyone can do it. Procurement, the theme of today, I think that is extremely important. And I think the most important way forward is to think about awarding pollution control there, because that gives you more power. So as long as you don't apply exclusion criteria, saying I won't buy unless you, then just award pollution control somehow in economical terms, you do not risk access to medicines, which is the most common critique that I hear about putting demands on the companies, that we would risk access. We just reward good behavior, we don't risk access. If no company can meet what you're rewarding, still it will be status quo. You would not lose access. And that also means that we shouldn't be scared about rewarding stepwise up to the highest ambition level that we think should be rewarded. We don't need to make compromises because companies say, oh, we can't reach that level. But if we say, but that is what we would like to reward the most, that's fine. If none can deliver that now, they may be reaching level 1 or 2, but not level 3. So be ambitious. It doesn't cost anything to be ambitious if you do it in a stepwise level. And we have initiatives already in Norway and Sweden. I think personally that the ambitions are a bit too low. I think they have listened a bit too much to industries there. And I think the ambition levels could go further and also award companies that takes this one step further than others. But procurement only affects a small portion of the flow of drugs, and that's important. We only channel a small portion of the flow through the hospitals that are procured. Most of the drugs go through pharmacies, and there it's another system that determines who is selling at least all the prescription drugs. It's about the generic substitution systems that decides which drug should be subsidized. And here we need to have something that award pollution control. And there's actually a pilot project now in Sweden that proposes to do that, but I have seen very little action for the last year because it was launched more than a year ago, and I don't see any action of this. I would love to hear more about what's happening. I think it's on the table of Läkemedelsverket, the medical agency in Sweden, and some others. And last, good manufacturing practices or regulation. I think that's very important. And I know that yesterday, the European Parliament accepted a resolution that said that environmental emissions and pollution should be part of GMP. So that is a big political step forward if this happens. Now, good manufacturing has its problems, as Anil mentioned, of course. Another problem with legislation compared to procurement is that you can risk access to medicines if you immediately enforce too high demands. And that will not be politically possible because we also want our drugs. So we have to do this a balanced way here on how we put demands in things that are compulsory like this. So we would need a pollution standard. That would be great because that would help many of these incentivizing actions. But, and I'll describe to you a little bit what's happening here. When we have a pollution standard, beware that bacteria, they are the ones that should be protected against antibiotics, not directly us. It's the bacteria that develop resistance. And they're present in the wastewaters. And the concentrations of drugs, antibiotics, they're highest in the wastewater, not in the rivers. It's diluted there. So the risk for resistance selection is highest in the wastewater, not in the recipient surface water. Now, the EMR Alliance, they're working to develop an international standard for responsible antibiotic manufacturing, as you can read in their progress report. But if you look at how the Alliance work, they want to apply these safe levels not to the wastewater, but to the waters to which they discharge. And the dilution can be 100 times or 1,000 times, meaning that in the wastewater, these safe levels may be exceeded by 1,000-fold. And still they say it's safe. And they also don't usually measure drug emissions. They estimate theoretically how much they lose. Basically, you bake a cake and you see how much cake you get, and then you can calculate how much you lost in the process. I really think that chemical measurements are needed. So when the industry now is developing a standard, it's an apparent conflict of interest if the polluter, in this sense, they're polluters, they set the standard. So if they develop a standard that is not protective, it will create lock-in effects because the incentives for themselves to update or sharpen their standard, that will be minimal, I think. And with a non-optimal standard, if we have a standard, it will be less incentives for others to develop it. So the solution to this, I think, is that we need an independent body, such as the WHO, that should develop and manage an international standard and update it when needed. And I think there could be a 2-level standard. I think you should apply safe labels in undiluted safe wastewater, which is the scientifically founded way to do it. And that can immediately be applied in, for example, procurement or subsidy decisions. But if you want to launch it in legislation, that may be jeopardizing access if you do it too fast. And I could then start with safe levels in surface waters, for example. But should we wait for this? This is my last slide. We don't need to wait a standard to start rewarding pollution. We can start to use procurement right now. And I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Very interesting. In the interest of time, I will just very fast hand over to Lisa again, who will tell us a bit about what tools are available for public buyers who want to work towards a more sustainable pharmaceutical production.
Thank you. I think I'll change this slide. Yes, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what kind of support that we have and what we offer. I'm going to tell you about our risk assessment tool that we recently launched and our sustainability criteria for pharmaceuticals. I wanted to start with this picture. This is an illustration of the procurement process. And what we want to highlight here is that public procurement is so much more than just awarding a contract, as you can see in the zone 2 here. And there's a lot of important work and decisions that has to be made in zone 1, the preparation phase, and also zone 3 to realize and to follow up and to make sure that the supplier really lives up to the criteria that you have set in your procurement is also, of course, very important. And we try to work, when we develop support with this model, and try to offer support in all of these zones. And well, the risks in the supply chain of pharmaceuticals, well, we heard about it. We have identified risks such as the right to safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, right to an adequate standard of living for surrounding communities, some cases poor working conditions. There are risks concerning water use and access to water, soil and groundwater pollution, and corruption risks, as Anil told us more about. And of course, it's not easy for a procurer who is responsible for providing goods and services for a region or a municipality to be aware of all of these risks. Of course, there are reports and informations and different that you can find from different organizations, but it's not easy to identify all of these risks. And that's why our agency has developed a risk analysis tool where you can find information about sustainability risks in the supply chain for different product groups, including pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, this is only available in Swedish, but if you're interested, you perhaps could translate it in some way, to use Google Translate or try to translate it in another way. And this is an illustration of the supply chain for pharmaceuticals. And as we've heard, there is generally a lack of solid and transparent information about the supply chain for pharmaceuticals. But what we have tried to do in this risk analysis tool is that we have tried to simplify the supply chain. So this is a very simplified illustration of the supply chain. So we have divided it into 3 steps: raw material, processing, and final production. And you will recognize, if you look at the supply chain for pharmaceuticals or textiles or fish, you will see this, that we had divided it into 3 steps, just to make it easier for a procurer to understand what the supply chain looks like. And of course, the supply chain will vary depending on the raw material that is used. And in this tool, you can find information, a description of the supply chain, information about ORIN, where products are typically being produced. You can find more information about risks. And when I talk about risks here, I talk about risk, human rights risks, workers' rights, environmental protection, and corruption risks. And you can also find information on how to manage these risks. And if there are any industry initiatives or sustainability certifications, you can also read more about that here. And the illustration on to the left, you can find where we have identified if the risks are high, middle high, or low. And of course, the products included in this tool are high-risk products, so there are generally high risks. And when it comes to human rights and workers' rights, there's not enough information to do risk assessment in the first step of the supply chain for pharmaceuticals. And well, we develop sustainability criteria. We do this together with contracting authorities and the suppliers and other organizations, such as NGOs, if it is relevant. Where we have over 900 criteria that can be used in public procurement, and both environmental and social criteria. They are voluntary to use, and we have the criteria in 3 levels: basic level, advanced level, and the spearhead level. And all our criteria are translated into English, so you can find it at our webpage if you're interested to read more about it. And the sustainability criteria for pharmaceuticals include information about where the production and formulation of API takes place, and this is award criteria. On an advanced level, we're asking for a countries. And on a spearhead level, we're asking for production facilities addresses. We have criteria concerning environmental risk information and risk management procedures for environmental API emissions, and also sustainable supply chains. And I just want to tell you a little bit more about our criteria for sustainable supply chains. We have contract performance clauses that can be used in 2 different levels. We have also developed support in how to do the follow-up form of a self-assessment questionnaire. And we also have a guidance that can be used both by contracting authorities as well as suppliers. And that's also available in English. So you can read more about that in our database if you're interested. And we're also started a revision of this criteria. And the criteria is based on international guidelines such as UN Guiding Principles and Business and Human Rights and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance. And we're also looking at to make sure that our criteria is in line with the upcoming EU legislation that the latest I heard shall be presented in December. So we have to, I look forward to read more about that. And the focus of the revision is, of course, clarity. What are the obligations of the suppliers? Approach to writings and the guidelines and the upcoming EU legislation. Develop the issues, and we're also talking about to include particularly vulnerable groups, zero tolerance for attacks on human rights defenders, traceability requirements, and also remedy. We also want to include conflict minerals if the text that can be used where it's relevant. And we're also looking at how to develop the follow-up and sanctions. So that was my last line. I think we can open up for a few questions. Anna.
Yes, right. I see that there has been some action in the chat, but I also believe that our panelists have been very active in answering those questions. So at this point, I don't know if there are any outstanding questions, but is there something in the chat that some of the panelists would like to comment on out loud, perhaps? No, but Lisa, we had a few points made from Joachim and Neil on what public buyers could do. Is that would you like to comment on the points made by them?
I haven't seen them. Can you read them?
Not in the chat, but in their presentations.
Oh, okay. Yes. I think that one point from Joachim is that it's important that these criteria are award criteria, so it's not mandatory. So if you don't live up to this criteria, you can you're not excluded from the procurement. So that's what we also recommend, that you use the criteria as an award criteria. So that that's.
And of course, there could be very basic things that could be exclusive criteria, but the more advanced things about that deals with things that are not regulated in law anyway, at least that's probably good to have like that.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Another thing that we tend to come back to when we talk about public procurement is the follow-up, of course, and in terms of how do you conduct audits and follow-up and so on. And I don't know if any one of the panels would like to answer that, if there are challenges with that in that regard.
Yeah, sure. There is, and there's been, and there are challenges with the audits for GMP as well, as we've all know. So audits is a big thing, and it's particularly important when you have regulatory demands, that when you make regulation in place, you need to also have an audit system that makes everything to play a fair game. But in procurement, I would argue that you do not yourself need to necessarily set up the audit system. You just need to describe what kind of audit will you reward. So if you have a requirement of a certain kind, that you have certain requirements on pollution control, you also require that the seller should have a third-party audit system in place that fulfills a certain number of criteria, and that audit report should be available for you. And you basically define the criteria. Then it's up to the seller to fulfill that criterion. So it doesn't necessarily need to set up an audit system. You could also make sure that you are just clear on what kind of audit system is it that is needed for this.
You to comment on that, Lisa?
Yes, I just wanted to say that it's not easy to make the follow-ups, obviously, and because of the lack of transparency in the supply chain. But you need to ask those questions, and follow-up is really important to and ask for transparency. So I just wanted to highlight that even if it's not easy, you have to ask the questions.
Right. So the clock has turned 11. I see we have a question from Healthcare Without Harm, but I'm afraid we have to address that in another forum. So I want to say thank you so much to all the speakers. I think we got that transparency is key here, and that public buyers can play a role in this. Thank you to the audience, and as I said, this webinar will be you will be able to watch it afterwards at our website for those of you who had some problems hearing us during the webinar. Yeah, thank you to the panel, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.